Sponsored by Ground News.
This month, roughly 1.4 billion people will prepare offerings for total strangers. Offerings ranging from fruit to smartphones to fake paper money. Why? Because it's the 7th month of the lunar calendar, and that means it's time for the annual Ghost Festival in China. So the offerings are for ghosts of people you might not even know. But why go through all the trouble and expense for ghostly strangers? Also, does this mean that everyone in China believes in ghosts? Today we'll be talking about what the Ghost Festival is, why and how it's celebrated, as well as how it got started in the first place. Also known as the Feast of the Middle Prime, or the Yulon Bulls Festival in Buddhism, the Ghost Festival falls on the 15th night of the 7th month of the lunar calendar. At the time of publishing this video in 2023, that's August 30th. On this day, all of the dead return to Earth, the righteous, wicked, and everyone in between, and ideally they return to their families. However, since not every spirit has a family to return to, or has an unfilial family that doesn't offer them sacrifice, people offer offerings for their ancestors and prepare offerings for any other ghost who happens to be in the neighborhood. Many cultures have similar Day of the Dead holidays, where the spirits of the dead are temporarily allowed to return to the world of the living. You might be familiar with Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, or how some might say that the spirits come out to play on October 31st, aka Halloween. Since Buddhism and Confucianism spread to Vietnam, Korea, and Japan, it's not surprising that those countries also traditionally celebrated a ghost festival on the 15th of the 7th month. For example, in Japan, it's called Obon. But today we're focusing on the Chinese version as part of our series on Chinese religions. So where did this festival come from? In the Confucian Analects, Confucius says, "Revere the ghosts and spirits, but keep a distance from them." This summarizes a recurring theme that we see throughout Chinese history regarding ghosts. The spirits of the dead deserve respect, but beware of their ambiguous and potentially dangerous power. Since as far back as we have written records in China, that's to say 1250 BCE, at least the elites believed that their ancestors continued to exist after death as spirits. We know this because the kings of the Shang dynasty had beliefs and practices about ancestors and ghosts recorded on bones or tortoise shells. These are the so-called oracle bones, a body of archaeological evidence critical for understanding ancient Chinese beliefs about ghosts. From the Shang oracle bones, we learned that ghosts were believed to cause illness to the king and his family. But we also learned that the spirits of the ancestors were powerful because they could communicate with Di, the original ancestor and the most supreme deity at the time. Humans couldn't do this because Di was too far removed to contact directly. So the king would make offerings to his ancestors and request that they in turn ask Di for the rain to fall on their crops or share insider information, like whether or not the king would win an upcoming battle. Things changed a bit in the subsequent Zhou dynasty. Di was replaced by heaven as the primary god, and people made offerings of rice, alcohol, and meat to the spirits, placing them in specialized bronze offering vessels like these, which were often inscribed with the name of the giver and their good behavior. Confucius references people making sacrifices to the ghosts, but seems to admonish people for making sacrifice to a ghost that is not one's own ancestor, calling it an act of sycophancy. His criticism seems to imply that this is something that people were doing. By the Han Dynasty in the early 2nd century BCE, the belief that people lived on after death as spirits was held by people in all levels of society, and ritual experts such as shamans and exorcists were employed to either communicate with them or expel them. So from the Shang oracle bones all the way up to the Han Dynasty, we see evidence that indigenous Chinese religion involved giving offerings to the spirits of deceased ancestors, but also a concern for malicious ghosts that can cause harm. But why are ghosts bothering the living so much? Well, it's because they're unhappy ghosts, and there are many, many reasons to be an unhappy ghost throughout Chinese history. Didn't get a proper burial? Unhappy. Died unmarried, childless, or died violently? Unhappy. Don't get enough offerings from your unfilial kids? Also unhappy. And unhappy ghosts are dangerous ghosts. Some feed on the vital essences of humans to maintain their own existence, which can cause illness or death. Others seek vengeance against their killers. Less overtly threatening ghosts beg for necessities. These are the so-called hungry ghosts. Some may feel hunger and thirst, but food and drink burst into flames upon touching their tongues. The point is, all of these ghosts cause trouble or can cause trouble for the living in some way. The solution was to conduct sacrifices at special shrines dedicated to these unhappy and, in many cases, unburied dead. These were accompanied by rituals designed to bind one soul to the spot while helping guide the other soul to the afterlife. Yeah, that's right, two souls. According to Chinese tradition, it was believed that a person had two souls, called the Po and the Hun. The Hun is the soul that goes on to the afterlife and has a nice time with the gods. The Po is the more physical side of the soul that stays in the tomb and enjoys all those sweet things that you buried with the body. These concerns also probably became more urgent several hundred years later, when traders from Central Asia started telling people in China about this new religion called Buddhism. With Buddhism came concepts like hells and reincarnation, which might have caused some concern. Before in Chinese tradition, bad people were punished and the good rewarded by heaven in this life. But now people are saying that maybe there are bad things you can do that send you to a bad afterlife, one of many Buddhist hells. If you watched our earlier video on the subject, Buddhist hells can be pretty scary. There are cold hells and hot hells, and hells where you get stabbed a lot. And you're stuck there maybe for thousands of years until you burn off those bad things and you get reborn. And you're not guaranteed to be reborn as a human if the things you did were bad enough. The Ghost Festival emerged out of this encounter between indigenous Chinese religion and Buddhism. It dates back to the Tang Dynasty and originally was a Buddhist holiday. By then, Buddhism was firmly entrenched in Chinese society, and a very popular Buddhist story seems to have inspired the festival, a story called Mu-Chou Saves His Mother, which is found in the Yulon Pen Sutra. As the story goes, the Buddha's disciple Mu-Chou discovers that his deceased mother is in the realm of hungry ghosts. Distraught by this realization, he asks the Buddha for help, who instructs Mu-Chou to make offerings to the monks on the 15th day of the 7th lunar month in order to help her. The merit of this action would be great enough to liberate 7 generations of ancestors from hell and grant them a better reincarnation. Mu-Chou makes the offerings, and thus his mother is saved. We have evidence in the late 500s CE that the Yulon Pen Festival was celebrated in South China, but gradually throughout the Tang Dynasty, the strictly Buddhist version of the festival and indigenous Chinese beliefs about ghosts were combined to create the Ghost Festival as we know it today, where everyone, regardless of religious association or belief, is expected to participate, and many of the offerings are made directly to the ghosts, not only to Buddhist monks and nuns. A Japanese monk named Enin gives us a first-hand glimpse of the Ghost Festival when he traveled toward the Tang capital in 840 CE. In all of the Buddha halls, pavilions, and cloisters were arrayed displays. Their radiant colors dazzled people, and their offerings were splendorous. Everyone in the city had come out to perform the ritual tour. This snapshot from medieval China shows that people from surrounding areas congregated in cities, where large seasonal markets popped up, kind of like what happened on major Christian holidays in medieval Europe. During the subsequent Song Dynasty, the Ghost Festival expanded to include all of the dead by incorporating new universal salvation rituals. For example, liturgies were dedicated to wandering spirits focused on the liberation rite of water and land, an extensive ritual in Chinese Buddhism that aims to liberate beings from suffering. During this period, offerings were made to the Buddhist monks and nuns to generate merit, but also to pay for these liturgical services and prayers for the dead. In this medieval period, theatrical performances of Mu-Chou Saves His Mother were also held. By the end of the 19th century, the Ghost Festival was a flourishing communal holiday throughout China. A Dutch ethnographer visited southeastern China during the festival in 1877 and wrote a detailed account of what he saw. Offerings of incense, food, and flowers piled on tables outside of houses, with monks leading processions throughout the city holding lanterns and banners while reciting mantras, and families feasting together in the evening. While the festival was suppressed during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, it regained its position in the later 20th century as one of the most important festivals in China. Today, many Chinese people consider the entire 7th month to be a free-for-all when it comes to ghosts, so sometimes you'll see the Ghost Festival described as lasting an entire month, and it's even sometimes called the Ghost Month, with the most important activities happening on the 15th day itself. In fact, someone's schedule might be filled with several overlapping celebrations throughout the entire month, sponsored by the government or private associations like clubs, minority communities, and businesses. In practice, this means someone might leave out simple offerings for the ancestors every day, but save the major offerings for the 15th. Anything that brings pleasure is considered an acceptable offering, both actual and paper versions. Standard offerings include food and alcohol, but can also include flowers, paper houses, and hell money. Hell money, also called joss money, is imitation money made from paper. Generosity matters, and you can never give too much or too expensive of stuff. To capitalize on this, Taiwanese supermarkets hold major sales during the Ghost Festival. In overseas Chinese communities in Singapore and Malaysia, as well as Hong Kong and parts of Taiwan, entertainers put on shows for the benefit of ghosts. These shows could be popular plays or operas, but also could be things like pole dancing. I'm not making this up. Pole dancing for ghosts is a thing. All of the physical offerings from the larger events are given to the poor after the end of the day's ceremonies, while the paper versions are burned in a large bonfire, sometimes along with the effigy of the king of the dead. In some communities, people set off firecrackers to scare away ghosts, though firecrackers have been banned in some urban areas. Famously, Beijing banned firecrackers in 2008 during the run-up to the Olympics, but bans have been in place off and on since the 90s. Some might attend rituals at the local Buddhist monastery, where the monks lead lay people in the recitation of the name of Buddha Amitabha, the most prominent Buddha in Pure Land Buddhism. In some monasteries, a portion of the offered food is ritually set aside for the hungry ghosts, placed outside of the hall on a special altar. Monks and nuns may also recite Buddhist scriptures for the benefit of the dead. Here we see nuns performing the precious penance of the Liang Emperor, a popular ritual during the ghost month. Of course, with all these ghosts wandering around, there's some things you'll need to avoid to stay safe. Taboos range from region to region, but include things like avoiding swimming at night, hanging clothing outside at night, and whistling at night. In fact, just avoid doing things outside at night in general. Oh, and don't make any big purchases or life decisions. That's inauspicious. The kids' version of the South China Morning Post published a list of things like don't wear red or black clothing, because spirits are attracted to these two colors. Or don't pick up a coin on the street because it could belong to an evil spirit or be used to possess a person. Pregnant women and infants are the most at risk of ghost possession, so if you can avoid being one of those things during the ghost month, that would be great. The festival ends with paper boats and lotus-shaped lanterns being released on the water to guide the spirits back to the afterlife. Some of these paper boats can be extremely elaborate. This one made in Malaysia for the 2022 Ghost Festival was 16 feet long. So does the Ghost Festival mean that everyone in China believes in ghosts? Scholars of religion don't generally like questions like this because answering questions about belief in the supernatural can be very difficult to answer without a million caveats. This is especially true in China, where religiosity is famously difficult for sociologists to measure. Now, sociologists have tried to measure Chinese religiosity by asking whether or not someone follows Chinese popular religion. But this is an academic category invented by academics for academics. Religious practice as it's practiced on the ground in China is too complicated to put under a single umbrella like this, because there's generally no exclusivity in any of the Chinese religions. Popular religious belief and practice have no set doctrines, can vary by region, and absorb and intertwine with elements from Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. Moreover, China is generally characterized as a very atheistic society, but at the same time, rates of people participating in popular religious practice, like making offerings to ghosts, are very high. As with any big cultural holiday, there are likely a range of responses to the idea of the existence of ghosts. What I can say is that for at least 1 month of the year, hundreds of millions of Chinese people act as if they believe in ghosts. So remember, no outdoor activities at night, leave plenty of food, and you'll have a great ghost festival. When it comes to contemporary news about religion, understanding the full picture can be very difficult in today's media landscape. News about religion is often filtered through a partisan lens and misrepresented to fit a particular narrative. That's why I turned to Ground News, today's video sponsor. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. Best way to explain it is to show you. Here's a story that caused a lot of controversy among my archaeologist friends. Israeli officials are considering physically uprooting an ancient Christian mosaic from the archaeological site Megiddo and loaning it to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., a museum that many academics have criticized for sloppy acquisition practices and for ideological bias. When we look this story up on Ground News, we see that this story has been covered by 32 news sources, overwhelmingly by left-leaning sources. If you compare the headlines, you'll start to see some interesting framing emerge. On the left, one of the headlines calls attention to the Museum of the Bible's religious affiliation, saying the mosaic may be sent, quote, to U.S. Evangelical Museum. While on the right, one headline explicitly mentions the biblical significance of the site, a mosaic found near Israel's prophesied site of Armageddon. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources, which you can see here on the side of the screen, all backed up by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News does not make these determinations themselves. Ground News also has a blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. Tools like this can help us see what's circulating in online echo chambers, or alert us to our own echo chamber. I highly recommend giving Ground News a try. Ground News is giving the Religion for Breakfast audience 30% off its Vantage plan. This includes access to a feature called My News Bias, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet. It shows you your reading habits, what are the top sources that you keep coming back to, and whether or not you're engaging with diverse perspectives. Go to ground.news/religion for breakfast, or click the link in the description below to get started, and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.